The dog was already dead, or close enough to it that the difference didn't seem to matter. Callum found her at the edge of the Coquihalla rest stop on a Tuesday in February, half buried under a drift of dirty snow, her black and tan coat so matted with ice that he almost walked past her entirely. He had pulled over only to check the chains on his rear tires. The highway patrol had been radioing all morning about black ice through the canyon, and he was not looking for anything except to get back in the truck and keep driving. That was all he did anymore. Keep driving. Keep moving, as if stillness was the thing that would finally undo him. He crouched down beside her. She was a shepherd cross of some kind, maybe 8 or 9 months old, and she was breathing in that shallow, irregular way that animals breathe when the body has already started the process of letting go. Her eyes were open but unfocused. There was dried blood along her left ear. Someone had put a rope around her neck at some point. The rope was gone now, but the raw skin beneath her collar told the whole story without a single word. Callum sat back on his heels in the snow and looked at her for a long moment. He was 53 years old. He had 2 replacement discs in his lumbar spine, a scar along his left forearm from Kandahar that he no longer bothered to explain to people, and a house in Merritt, British Columbia, that he had bought 18 months ago because it was the place farthest from the ocean that he could think of, and he had needed to be far from the ocean. The ocean reminded him of Bracken. Bracken had been a Belgian Malinois, 11 years old. The best working dog Callum had ever partnered with in 22 years of naval special operations, and he had partnered with a few. Bracken had been retired 18 months before Callum himself put in his papers, and Callum had adopted him immediately, had been planning it for years. If he was honest, had already bought the dog bed and the stainless bowls and a ridiculous tartan blanket from a shop in Victoria that Bracken immediately dragged into the corner and refused to sleep anywhere near. They had 8 months together in the house in Esquimalt, 8 months of slow mornings and long walks along the harbor, and a routine that felt, for the first time in Callum's adult life, like something a person could actually live inside. Then Bracken's kidneys began failing, as they sometimes do in working dogs of his age and breed who have spent years in the field. It went quickly, 6 weeks from diagnosis. Callum had held him on the floor of Dr. Frazier's clinic in Langford on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of August, and when he drove home afterward, he sat in the driveway for 2 hours without going inside, and after that he sold the house and moved to Merritt and did not look at the ocean again. He looked at the dog in the snow. She looked at nothing. He said out loud, to no one in particular, "This is not my problem." Then he took off his jacket, wrapped her in it, and put her in the passenger seat of the truck. The nearest emergency vet was 40 minutes south in Kamloops, and Callum drove it in 34, which was either very good time or a genuine public hazard depending on your point of view. He kept one hand on the wheel and one hand resting lightly on the dog's side, so he could feel whether she was still breathing. She was. Barely but consistently, and by the time he pulled into the parking lot of Sagebrush Animal Hospital she had begun to shiver, which he chose to interpret as a good sign. The vet on call that night was a compact, efficient woman named Dr. Ossie, who wore her hair in 2 small braids and spoke with the deliberate calm of someone who has delivered enough difficult news to understand the value of an even voice. She took one look at the dog, asked Callum 3 questions. When did you find her? Has she been conscious? Do you know what happened? And then she was already moving, and a technician named Prem was already taking the dog from Callum's arms with a gentleness that he found unexpectedly difficult to watch. "Wait here," Dr. Ossie said. "There's coffee in the waiting room. It's bad, but it's hot." Callum sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and drank the bad hot coffee, and stared at the wall across from him, which had a poster about dental hygiene for cats. He was not sure how long he sat there. At some point Prem came out and told him the dog was stable, that she had moderate hypothermia and a healing rib fracture that was at least 3 weeks old, and that whoever had owned her before had not been doing a very good job of it. "Are you the owner?" Prem asked, with careful neutrality. "No," Callum said. "Are you planning to be?" Callum looked at the cat dental poster. The cat in the photo looked extraordinarily smug about the condition of its teeth. "I'll pay for tonight," he said. "Whatever she needs tonight." It was not an answer to the question, Prem wrote something on his clipboard and didn't push it. Dr. O.C. came out just before midnight and sat down across from Callum with the directness of a person who has things to say and intends to say them. "She's going to be fine," she said. "The ribs are healing on their own, there's no frostbite that I can see, and her temperature is coming back up. She's young. Young animals recover quickly when someone gives them the chance." "Good," Callum said. "She'll need to be monitored for the next 48 hours, and she'll need somewhere to go after that." Dr. O.C. looked at him steadily. "I can contact the SPCA in the morning. They'll take her. They're good people, and they'll find her a home eventually." "Eventually," Callum said. "She's a shepherd mix. Large breed. A little older than puppyhood. Not always the easiest placement." Callum rubbed the back of his neck. He had driven 40 minutes in the dark with his jacket off in February and his hand on the side of a dying dog. And now he was sitting in a vet's waiting room at midnight, being spoken to by a woman who clearly already knew what he was going to do and was simply giving him the time to arrive at it himself. "I have a house in Merritt," he said finally. "It's not much. Big yard." Dr. O.C. nodded once, as if this was entirely unsurprising information. "She'll be ready Thursday morning." He drove home through the canyon in the dark with the heater running and the passenger seat empty. The jacket was still in the back, stiff with dried snow. He didn't touch it. He named her Hazel. He wasn't sure why. It came to him the first morning she was home, when she was sitting by the kitchen window watching the light come through the bare branches of the willow tree in the backyard, and her eyes caught the color of that particular February sun, and the word arrived before he had decided to think about it. Hazel. She turned and looked at him when he said it, the way dogs sometimes do when they hear a word that sounds like it belongs to them, and that was that. She was cautious, at first, in the specific way that animals are cautious when they have learned not to trust what appears safe. She would not come to him directly. She approached everything in her own time, circling slowly, assessing, and only moving forward when she had determined the route well enough to retreat if necessary. Callum recognized this. He had done the same thing himself for the past 18 months, moving around the edges of his own life, unwilling to commit to the center of anything. He did not push her. He sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet and let her come to him on her own schedule, which took 4 days. On the 4th evening, she walked across the kitchen, put her chin on his knee, and looked at him with the complete and devastating sincerity that only dogs are capable of. And Callum found that he had nothing to say to that, so he just put his hand on her head and sat there. It was the first time in a year and a half that he had touched another living thing and meant it. February became March. The snow retreated up the hillsides above Merritt like something embarrassed of itself. Hazel discovered the backyard, really discovered it, the way young dogs discover space, with enormous physical enthusiasm and absolutely no strategy. She chased the magpies. She dug a hole under the fence that Callum filled in, and she dug again and he filled in again, and they reached a kind of mutual exhaustion on the subject and left it at that. She was also, as it turned out, extraordinarily vocal. This was not something Callum had expected, and in the first weeks he was not sure what to make of it. She didn't bark, not exactly, or not only. She had a whole catalogue of sounds, low warbling queries when she wanted his attention, long rising howl songs when she heard something interesting in the distance, short percussive grumbles that were clearly commentary on specific things she found objectionable, including but not limited to the vacuum cleaner, the neighbor's wind chimes, the smell of canned tomatoes, and Callum's tendency to sit on the porch for too long without acknowledging her. The first time she did it in front of another person was mid-March. His neighbor from 2 doors down, a retired schoolteacher named Beverly Marsh, 71, originally from Cape Breton, with the directness that sometimes comes from that particular origin, had knocked on his door to return a set of socket wrenches she had borrowed in January. Callum had been avoiding the knock for 15 minutes, but Hazel had discovered that pushing her nose into his knee made the delay stop working, so eventually he opened the door. Beverly Marsh looked down at Hazel. Hazel looked up at Beverly Marsh. Then Hazel made a sound that could best be described as a formal greeting, delivered in a language that was almost but not quite English. Beverly Marsh laughed, a real laugh, the kind that takes a person briefly by surprise, and said, "Well, hello to you too." And then she looked at Callum and said, "You're the fellow who bought Gord's place. You've been here more than a year and I don't think I know your name." His name was Callum Byrne. He told her. She told him hers. Hazel looked between them with obvious satisfaction, as if this exchange was the direct result of her intervention, which it probably was. Beverly came back on Thursday with a casserole, because she was from Cape Breton, and that is what you do. And she sat at Callum's kitchen table for an hour and told him things about the neighborhood that he hadn't known because he had been careful not to know them. There was a family 2 streets over, Dara and her husband Noel, who had lost their lab last autumn and still had a dog door they didn't know what to do with. There was an old man at the end of the block, name of Arthur Teal, who had been a merchant marine for 40 years, and now sat on his porch from 2 to 4 every afternoon regardless of weather, and would talk to anyone who stopped. There was a community garden that had been started and then somewhat abandoned, and Beverly had opinions about this. Callum listened to all of it. He hadn't intended to listen. He had opened the door expecting nothing, and ended up with the kind of dense, incidental information about a place that you only get from someone who actually belongs to it. When Beverly left, Hazel sat by the door and made the low warbling sound. "Don't look at me like that," Callum said. Hazel looked at him exactly like that. He met Arthur Teal the following week, which was Hazel's doing as well, though Arthur would later claim full credit. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Callum had taken Hazel out along the back road that ran above the neighborhood because she needed the longer walk. And he needed to be somewhere without walls. Arthur was on his porch in a canvas chair with a thermos of coffee and the expression of a man who is absolutely fine with sitting in 37-degree weather because he has been cold in much worse places, and this is, comparatively speaking, pleasant. Hazel stopped at the fence. She did not bark. She sat down and produced the formal greeting sound, and Arthur Teal lowered his thermos and looked at her over the top of his glasses for a long moment. "Is that a dog or a small person in a dog suit?" he said. "I ask myself the same thing," Callum said. Arthur's name was Arthur Teal, and he was 81 years old, and he had sailed container ships out of Halifax and then Vancouver for the better part of 4 decades, and had stories that required no embellishment whatsoever, and he delivered them in a flat, unhurried voice that made even the dangerous parts sound ordinary, which made the dangerous parts considerably more frightening. He had a daughter in Kelowna, who called every Sunday, and a son in Halifax who called when he remembered, and he did not complain about either arrangement. After that, Callum and Hazel stopped at Arthur's fence on most Thursday afternoons. Sometimes Callum brought coffee. Sometimes Arthur had already made too much. Hazel sat between them and delivered her observations on the proceedings, with the confidence of a board member, who understands she is the most important person in the room. Spring came properly in April, and with it came the thaw that turned the back lane behind Callum's house into something that was not quite a creek, but was too wet to ignore. He spent a Saturday afternoon doing drainage work along the fence line, which was the kind of project he had been meaning to do for months, and had used the winter as an excuse to avoid. He was on his knees in the mud, wrestling with a length of perforated pipe, when a voice said, "You're doing that wrong." He looked up. Standing at the fence was a boy, maybe 9 years old, in rain boots and a jacket that was slightly too big for him. The boy was looking at the pipe with the critical expression of someone who has seen drainage projects go wrong before. "Is that right?" Callum said. "You need to angle it more toward the lane or the water just pools at your post." "My dad says so." "Your dad knows about drainage?" "He's a plumber. He says everyone does drainage wrong." Callum sat back on his heels. "What's your name?" "Kearney," the boy said. "Kearney Walsh. We live on Sutherland. My dog is Poppy, but she died last year." He delivered this last fact with the straightforward grief of a child who has not yet learned to hedge the things that hurt. "Your dog is really loud." "I know, my mom says she sounds like she's trying to talk." "Your mom is right." Kearney Walsh thought about this. "Could I pet her?" Hazel was already at the fence. Callum nodded, and Kearney reached through the gap in the boards, and Hazel put her entire face into his hand and made the low warbling sound that apparently passed for her version of an enthusiastic welcome, and Kearney Walsh laughed with his whole body the way 9-year-olds do, completely and without reservation, and Callum found that he had to look away for a moment, because the sound of it caught him somewhere in the chest. Kearney started coming by on Saturdays. His mother, a tall, quiet woman named Ingrid Walsh, who worked as a respiratory therapist at Royal Inland Hospital, and had the particular competence of someone who solves real problems every day, came with him the first time to establish that her son was not imposing on a complete stranger without context. She shook Callum's hand, introduced herself, and said with the directness he was beginning to recognize as a neighborhood trait, "He's talked about your dog every single day for 2 weeks. I thought I should meet the dog." Hazel demonstrated several of her vocals. Ingrid Walsh watched this with the expression of a scientist observing an unexpected result. "Beverly was right," she said finally. "She really does sound like she's saying something." "Beverly talks to you about my dog?" Callum said. "Beverly talks to everyone about your dog. You've become a topic." Ingrid almost smiled. In a good way, mostly. Callum wasn't sure what to do with this information. He had been in Merritt for 18 months. He had bought his groceries and fixed his truck, and nodded at people he passed on the street, and believed sincerely that he had maintained a level of careful invisibility that would allow him to proceed through the rest of his life without inconveniencing anyone. Apparently, Hazel had not been cooperating with this plan. May. The lilac bush along the back fence came into bloom, and Hazel spent 3 days investigating it with the thoroughness of a customs official who suspects something is being concealed. Callum bought seeds for the community garden on a Monday morning because Beverly had mentioned it, and he had nothing better to do. And then he found himself there every Tuesday and Thursday with a trowel and an increasingly strong opinion about the spacing of tomato plants, which was not a thing he had ever expected to have opinions about. He met Dara Okafor there, and her husband Noel, who was a high school teacher, and made elaborate puns that were significantly better than Callum initially expected. He met a young woman named Preethi Nair, who was completing a nursing degree at Thompson Rivers, and grew dahlias with the seriousness of an advanced project. He met a pair of brothers in their late 60s, Alistair and Gordon Finch, who had retired from the same postal route and now spent their days in amiable argument about everything from soil pH to NHL standings. None of this was something Callum had gone looking for. He had gone to the garden because Beverly had mentioned it, and Beverly had come to his door because Hazel had pushed him off the couch, and Hazel had been found at a rest stop because Callum had pulled over to check his tire chains. It was the smallest possible chain of events, and it had led him here. Standing in good soil on a Tuesday morning, talking to people he knew by name, in a place he had been for a year and a half without knowing any of them at all. The photograph was Preethi's idea. It was a Sunday in June, and she had brought her good camera. An actual film camera, which she used to document things she wanted to remember. And she had spent the morning moving through the garden with the quiet attention of someone who is very serious about what she's doing. Callum had been helping Noel string up a second row of bean poles, and Hazel had been doing what Hazel did, which was serve as a roving ambassador of goodwill and vocalized commentary. At some point, Arthur had arrived. He did that sometimes now, walked the 3 blocks from his porch to the garden, and took up a position in the canvas chair he'd started leaving there, contributing opinions on whatever was happening, and occasionally helping with tasks that required only his hands and not his back. Beverly was there. Kearney was there with his rain boots, even though it hadn't rained in 2 weeks. Alistair and Gordon were arguing about whether the kale needed thinning. Ingrid had stopped by on her way back from a morning shift and had a coffee in her hand, and was laughing at something Gordon had said. Hazel was sitting in the middle of all of it, perfectly still for once, looking around at the gathered people with the expression she had when she felt a situation was proceeding correctly. Preethi said, "Hold on, nobody move," and she raised the camera. Callum was at the edge of the frame, and he almost stepped back out of it. His first instinct was always to step back. But Hazel chose that exact moment to turn and look at him and make the sound she made when she thought he was being slow about something, the low, particular sound that was unmistakably directed and unmistakably meant something, and Kearney heard it and laughed, and Beverly heard it and shook her head, and the shutter clicked. Preeti printed a copy for him. He didn't ask her to. She just appeared at the door one afternoon with a small envelope and a look that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. He opened it after she left. In the photograph, there was a garden in early summer. There were bean poles and kale and the corner of a tomato cage. There was Arthur Teal in his canvas chair, talking to Alistair or Gordon. It was hard to say which, because all three men had the same posture of complete ease. There was Kearney, mid-law, head thrown back, the way children laugh when nothing hurts yet. There was Ingrid and Beverly and Noel. And there, at the edge of the frame, not quite stepping back, was Callum. He was looking at the dog. Hazel was looking back at him with those eyes that were the color of winter light through willow branches. And whatever she was saying, whatever she was always saying, in the language that was almost but not quite something he could name. It was the thing that had started all of this. The rest stop in the canyon. The jacket in the snow, the drive to Kamloops in the dark with one hand on the wheel and one hand on her side, checking. He had told himself he was not looking for anything that February morning. He had pulled over to check his chains and he had meant to keep moving. But you can only move through your own life for so long before something stops you. Sometimes it is grief that stops you. Sometimes it is weather. And sometimes, if you are paying the smallest amount of attention, it is a dog who is almost gone. Breathing too slowly in the dirty snow, who needs someone to make a decision. He had made it. He stood in the kitchen of his house in Merritt on a June afternoon and looked at the photograph, and Hazel put her chin on his knee the way she had the first time. And the light came through the window the same way it had. On that first morning when he'd looked at her eyes and found the word for what they were, and he thought, this is what it feels like when a place becomes a place you live in. He thought. Bracken would have liked her. And for the first time in a long time, that thought did not arrive like something to be survived. It arrived like something true that he was finally able to hold.